I get the great privilege and honor of introducing Robin Butterfield. I've known Robin, I don't want to say how many years, but a lot of years. And how I met Robin Butterfield is she was actually our Director of Indian Education for the state of Oregon. And when I was working prior to this at a parent center, I was the Indian outreach specialist, and I got to know Robin in her work, and also from the National Indian Education Association. She has served over 5 3-year terms with the National Indian Education Association. She is also the past president. So she is very well respected in the field of Indian Ed. I can't think of anybody I feel more honored to know than Robin. She has worked in the past for the National Education Association as the liaison for minority community outreach. She knows a lot about outreach to minority families and populations. Fortunate for us, she's retired, so she is now contracting with us to provide all of the kind of written curriculums that you see that we provide is mostly Robin's handiwork. She's also worked professionally at the Bureau of Indian Education. She's been a staff trainer. She's been a product developer. She has had a variety of jobs. She's also worked in the Regional Educational Technical Assistance Center, the Northwest Regional Educational Laboratories for the Indian Education Program. She is highly respected throughout all national, state, local Indian Ed programs. So with that, I would like to have the great honor of turning this over to Robin Butterfield. Thank you, Robin.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Judy. And it's really an honor to be able to be working with the center. And I hope that this information is going to be beneficial to everybody. I'm going to take myself off of the screen and just focus on the slides. One of the reasons why we started with this particular presentation was because all over Indian country, folks are always frustrated with trying to get Native parents involved in education. And I have been working at the district level and, as Judy said, at the state level. And I know how difficult it can be sometimes to get engagement from parents. And so one of the things that we discussed was, why is this so difficult? And also, why are Native parents seem to be even tougher than maybe some other groups? And those reasons kind of lie in this historical perspective. And so we felt it was really important for people to understand, why this is happening. So in this presentation, we hope to accomplish sort of 3 main things. And as I begin to go into each slide, I want to reassure everybody, and maybe Kelsey can show you on this first slide, that each one of the slides will have talking points. So if you're standing in my shoes at some point, we're trying to provide a little bit of extra information on the slide. So Kelsey, can you show them the talking points, for example, so that you won't feel like you're, unprepared to make the discussion. So, so you can go ahead and take that off, Kelsey, and we'll just start right in. So a lot of this information also came from the Indian Nations at Risk study, which happened in 1992. I can't believe it's been that long. But many of the issues that have been surfacing in terms of involvement of parents, was really detailed pretty well in a paper that I wrote for the Indian Nations at Risk. And I think once you sort of understand the history, it sort of provides a real insight as to why it's been so difficult. So in this presentation, number one, we want to provide some of that historical background. Secondly, give you the reasons why even today, I mean, we can talk about things back in history, but why is that still an issue today in terms of getting parents and communities involved in education? And some of that we'll talk about this historical trauma and the legacy of being an oppressed subgroup within the United States. And then number three are what we really want to leave you with are some strategies for how to improve parental outreach and engagement, and specifically think about what are the things that centers can do to overcome some of the barriers. So we want to talk, this presentation is divided into kind of three sections. The first section is the first two bullets there. We want to just sort of reference a little bit about what tribes were like before contact, and then moving into how education was viewed even way back when Native people started being pulled away from their communities into school, and then spend a little bit more time on the next three bullets: institutionalizing Native education, what boarding schools did, and because of boarding schools, what are some of the deep scars that still remain in communities, and how much that has impacted Native community attitudes about formalized schooling. We also want to just highlight some important reports if anybody's interested in looking deeper into what some of those reports had to offer, but then talk about what are some of the more current strategies in terms of federally funded programs, and then end with some of the implications for staff and what we think needs to happen now. So those are the sort of pre-history, contact and institutionalized schooling, some kind of key historical reports, and then solutions. Okay, so at this point, if I were doing this with people in front of me, I think it's really important to tap into the knowledge of the audience. And so we've embedded in this PowerPoint an activity that you could use to do that, to sort of get people thinking about a historical perspective along with current events. And so one of the really fun activities, and some of you may have used something like this, is we've created a bingo activity which is listed on your handouts if you look on the organizing documents there, along with the PowerPoint. And so I'm just going to talk through a little bit how this bingo works. So we put the slide up, of course, and people will read the directions. You get and if you can look at the actual sheet, I think you'll understand what I'm talking about. But it's a series of 25 squares, and you put your name in the middle one. And then depending on the size of the group, you can say each person can only sign one square for somebody else, because each square will ask the question, who knows something? So you're trying to find somebody in the room who knows the answer to each one of those squares. And so if you have a small group like we have today, I would say you can sign no more than 2 squares, so that everybody can participate. And you also want to allow folks to keep playing until they get a blackout, although we usually call time before that happens. So it's an activity that's designed to be kind of an energizer, but also to tease out information from the participants in the room. So the other key direction there is it's a learn as you go bingo. So if, for example, you don't know the answer to one of the squares, and in the course of seeking these signatures, somebody else does know the answer and they tell it to you, then from that point on you can sign that for somebody else. So and an example for that might be, who knows what the Bolt decision focused on. And so if I don't know that and somebody comes up and says, oh, well, I know that the Bolt decision was a really important landmark decision that dealt with treaty rights around fishing in the Northwest, then at that point I could sign that square for somebody else. Let's see, so I think those are kind of the general directions. And then what I usually do before we start, because people are always kind of chomping at the bit, I just model one of the questions, because some people will say, well, they'll walk up to someone and say, well, can you sign number 18 for me? And often that can become an inhibitor to somebody's participation if they don't know the answer to 18. So I always encourage people to do it in an open sort of question process, just to say, hand the bingo sheet to someone and say, what square can you sign for me? And then as you progress through, then you only need to target squares that you don't have answers for. But you just encourage people to holler out bingo, but keep playing until you've gotten a blackout. So then we move to the most important thing, I think, from a trainer's perspective. I never do an activity unless I have time to debrief it adequately. And this activity itself could become a whole workshop if you wanted to. But if you focus on, at this point, we're just trying to gauge some general awareness of Indian history and culture, and if you want to adapt the squares to anything that's more focused on the tribes in your area, certainly feel free to do whatever you want with the idea of the bingo and modify the questions. So what I always ask, and it's a simple way to debrief activities, you may have already used it, is asking 3 key questions, and those questions are what, so what, and now what. So the what question may seem sort of rudimentary, because it basically, the what question is asking participants to describe the process of the activity that we just went through. So I've given some directions, and people have gotten up and moved around the room and collected signatures. These are the kinds of responses people will say. And then I'll say, because I keep saying, what else will we do? What else did we do? So focusing on them, having them think about the process. And then as you do that, it's also a reminder of, for you as a trainer, what steps you might have missed, or it pulls out what the audience is getting out of the activity without you having to even say a lot of extra things. But number one, it opens up the discussion from the group, and they don't have to have the answers to the questions at this point. They're just participating in what they observed. It's an adult learning theory kind of strategy. It also reinforces for the whole group sort of the steps that they went through if they want to use that in the future. And more importantly, what's really intriguing even about asking process questions, you're going to get a wide variety of different responses. Some people will focus on, the conversation they had with a participant. Others may just like the getting up and being able to move, but it's also a good ELL strategy, by the way, because just to be able to describe process is an ELL process. So then the next question is, so what did we just do? And then the middle question, the what, we just talked about. The so what is, why did we do this? And we know from working with adults that everybody brings meaning into the room from their own experience. So it's really important to ask people what they got out of it. As a trainer, I have some very specific goals for this activity, but it's really important to sense what the participants have gotten out of it. And so it helps to, these are some of the things that you might hear. Well, it stimulated some discussion. It highlighted how much or even how little people knew. It suggests that we can learn more together. So if I don't know something, I can, gain that information from others. It also suggests how much maybe is not taught about American Indians, especially when you get to some of the more contemporary questions on the bingo. And then it also suggests that, you know, all of us, staff as well as participants, might need to do a little more homework in understanding, you know, Native communities in general. And that information that is important to the Native community may not be in the mainstream, and that's why sometimes there's a disconnect. And I think also it's a non-threatening kind of an activity, but because it's okay if you don't know. But I think it also highlights, I'll give you one example that I've used often in this bingo. When I was doing another type of training in the eastern part of Oregon, I asked the question when we finished, and we only take about 12 minutes for people to sort of wander around and collect signatures. And I asked at the end, I said, was there anybody who felt uncomfortable using this card? And one of the teachers, this was a teacher group, said, yes, she said, I didn't know a lot of the questions, but I really don't see the point. And I felt uncomfortable. And I said, well, that's a really good comment, because if you felt uncomfortable in a 12-minute activity, I said, imagine what it must feel like to be a Native student in a school district that never gets to talk about the things that they value and are important to them in 12 years of education. We use questions as a way to validate what's important to know and to talk about. And so even in a simple little bingo activity, we can highlight some really important kind of ideas about where we are cross-culturally with each other. But if you actually, once you've circulated, you do take some time, and I don't answer every square. Usually in the debrief, I will say, what are some key questions that you want to be sure you get an answer to? And we'll just take about, no more than 5. And so maybe somebody will ask about the canoe journey, and then I always ask the group to answer first. I've got all the answers in the answer sheet that you also will have. But I try to allow people in the room to demonstrate their level of knowledge and expertise, because again, I'm also assessing, generally where the experts are in the room that might be able to, tap into the conversation. So I always let the group answer first, and if they can't, then I will respond. And you've got your little cheat sheet with all the answers to this. And so I think you get at this point, you get at actual content. Who knows what Title VI provides? Well, we're doing a whole slideshow on the Indian Education Act and what those resources are and how they can be used by parent centers and schools in general in each of the communities. Just general things, who are authors that are well known in Indian country. It's really important to think about treaties, because they are such a central concept in terms of understanding where Indian people are coming from and why they are entitled by law to certain types of benefits. And so you can get in, like I said, you can get into a whole workshop just on the level of questions that are asked in the squares. There's some mention of the largest national Indian organizations, NIEA, the National Indian Education Association, and NCAI, the National Congress of American Indians. We also talk a little bit about sovereignty in one of the squares, and who can just name some of the tribes in their area, just some basic types of information. So that's the second question is what? Why did we do this activity? So it's to give some information about Indian country and Indian history, but not just get mired down in it, just to give a sampling. And then the last question I said, we did what, so what, and now what. The now what is, how might this activity benefit you in the future? Could you use this bingo style of activity with parents? Absolutely. Done this a lot with parents. Can you tailor it to the tribes in your area? Yes. Can you use it with a variety of other agencies or organizations like Judy mentioned? Yeah, so and people will have some creative ideas of what they got out of it and how they might use it. So now we're going to, now we've just done the bingo activity, and we want to talk a little bit about some of the things that might have been referenced in terms of history, but we want to start from a place of understanding where Indian people came from before contact, and that is that, and today most indigenous communities across the globe have begun to talk to each other about their common experience, you know, when they were taken over by another culture. But I think one of the most important places to start is to recognize that Native people cherish their children. They always have cherished their children. When my children were born, I am a Ho-Chunk, or I'm Winnebago and I'm Chippewa, or in our language, Ho-Chunk means the people, and Anishinaabe, you know, in Chippewa means the people. And so we always had our own languages, and we had our own worldview, and we cherished our children. My children came home from the hospital wearing little Winnebago moccasins that had an intentional hole put in the heel to remind me that they were mostly a spirit being that had come in physical form, and that they needed that hole in the moccasin to anchor them to this place and time. And so there were lots of traditional practices that, you know, truly honored the spirit of that baby. And many of the traditional child rearing practices may not be talked about, but they might be embedded in certain ceremonies and things that happen in communities. But, you know, the cultures were intact pre-contact. The whole community was responsible for the care of children. In many tribes, the aunts and uncles were the disciplinarians, and so all the parents had to do was just lavish their children with love and time and attention. So they were cherished, very special gifts to a community. And so most of the education took place as needed. It was experience-based, and there was a certain sort of understanding of, I've heard this expressed in this way: I do, you watch; I do, you do; I watch, you do. So the transitioning of an expert to a novice was basically in observation, you know, talking and observing together. And that embodied many of the values like courage, love, generosity, etc. And it's important to remember that many communities still possess much of their traditional tribal systems, and you may not even be aware how they're operating. But in all of our traditional gatherings, for example, in Winnebago country, where I'm from, you know, generosity, it's not, well, if you go to a powwow, for example, it's, if you're the head dancer, your responsibility is to give to others. It's like on your birthday, it would be like you giving presents to everybody who came in. You aren't the receiver of gifts. You are expected to take care of the other people in the room. So anytime you're honored, you're also supposed to give. So you're fostering that value of generosity, respect for others, caring for your community. In, you know, the Northwest here, with many of the tribes that are seven drums religion, they believe that there's a whip man that used to come around to communities, and their job was to discipline children so that the parents day to day didn't have to do that. So if you think about that, if that's coming, if you're working in a community where that used to be the tradition, you could see why there's a much more laissez-faire attitude about the upbringing of children, because somebody else is going to do the hard work of, you know, having to discipline them for something that they did wrong. I just came back from the Southwest where I was at the Taos Pueblo Feast and observed a morning run that was a competition between both sides of the community, and they got up early in the morning, and two sets of men from the community were competing against each other, running in bare feet on cold ground without shirts, and it was cold out. We were wearing blankets, and every male in the community, from tiny little, as young as I think 5-year-olds, all the way up to grandparents, were competing in this race. I mean, think of the values about fitness, community participation, doing your best. It didn't matter if they were chubby or skinny or in good shape or not. They were participating, and they were being cheered on by all the females in that community. So there's this real sense of cohesiveness and love and generosity and expectation for doing well. So pre-contact, I think there's many wonderful things that can be tapped into in terms of working with Native parents and communities. So this is just a quick quote to kind of emphasize what a stark contrast formalized education created. So this is a quote that references back to 1744 with an elder describing how young people were unfit for tribal life once they came back to their community. They couldn't speak the language, they seemed to be disoriented, and in this elder's perspective, unable to even make a worthwhile contribution to the tribe. So non-Native education was never intended to acknowledge Native cultures. There was an assumption that everything needed to be changed, that the language needed to change, the way of making a living needed to change, everything. So you can see from that very first quote that there was almost immediate culture shock. So as education became institutionalized, there was a treaty signing period that ended around 1871, and that's just dating the last treaties that were signed. So during those treaties, there was an agreement struck between two sovereigns, the tribal sovereign and the sovereign of the newly formed United States. And in that agreement, the federal government promised that they would educate Native children. But it was from the philosophy, if you drop down in the slide, from the philosophy of kill the Indian, save the man. So nothing of value, it was like an empty vessel. There was nothing there of value, and that it just needed to be filled up with other kinds of things. So to do that effectively, Native children were removed from their families and communities and sent hundreds of miles away. Places like Alaska sent children all the way to Oregon. Natives in California were sent to Oklahoma. Tribes were sent literally thousands of miles away. And so only by removing children from their communities could these empty vessels be filled well with this new information that they needed to be a functioning contributor of society. And the institution that was used to provide this education were, of course, boarding schools. And so the notion was assimilation, and that means, like I just said, take everything away and add something new. There's a different word that's called acculturation, which, even though the intent of boarding schools was to completely change, what usually happens to human beings is they tend to hang on to things and make choices, sometimes unconsciously or consciously, about what they keep and what they discard. And so in the boarding school era, a lot of tribal people, even though they were punished for speaking their language, still tried to hang on to their native languages and try to go home if they could. Many children died in the process of returning home. But the boarding schools were very strict and harsh institutions because they were run like military camps. And so children weren't allowed contact with their families. Many, almost the entire time they were in those schools. And I don't know if they didn't go to 12th grade back then, but until they were actually done with their schooling and had learned a trade, they were not allowed to go home. Sometimes they were allowed maybe during the summers, but many of the children had to work during the summer. But their hair was cut, they were punished for speaking their language. I think were taught obviously a very different curriculum and mostly a trade. Many of the early boarding schools took the girls and taught them how to, be domestics or teachers or nurses if they had showed, some propensity for that kind of learning. So it was not a pleasant place for children. The comfort they found mostly was in being in a collective with other Native children. So what did people learn about formal schooling based on this idea of boarding schools is that basically parents were to have nothing to do with their children's formal schooling. So there was tribal life and then formal schooling, which was seen as the enemy. And I don't know if any of you have ever seen the movie The Rabbit-Proof Fence, but it's a story about 3 little girls in Australia who are Aboriginal children who try to return home after they've been removed from their community. And there is a scene where they are removing the children and the grandmothers are chasing after the car that has picked up these little girls, and it's heartbreaking. And in the sort of showing of how the film was made, they said the staff and all of the actors were in tears, even just portraying what actually happened, because it was so painful, for the families to be broken up the way they were. And so the understanding of doing that with tribes was that their only job related to education at that time was to let their children go and not know what was actually happening to them day to day. So they were intentionally severed from the process of formal schooling. So the consequences are really severe for Native communities, is that they learned that education was about taking their children away from them, and so they began to mistrust the value of it. Children lost all of their traditional practices and the role of what their parents should be in their lives. They did not get accurate information even about who they were and where they came from, and it definitely created young people who did not know how to be parents because they hadn't been in the company of their own parents for so long. So the scars, they call this historical trauma, are deep, and they have remained in communities, long after the boarding schools were mostly closed. And so I should say today there are still boarding schools, although there are very few of them, but most of the ones that exist are operated through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and they're actually looked at as a place where Native children can go to be educated with Native children and other Native students, I should say, because a lot of them are more high schools. And there are some dormitories that still house children, for example, on Navajo, that have to travel great distances to get to school every day. But, and I think there's one up in Browning, Montana, but by and large the boarding school idea was recognized as being a failure in terms of its impact on communities and impact on individuals. But in Chemawa, for example, we get Native students from all over the Northwest and some even from Alaska still today. And they focus a lot more on developing Native pride and servicing kids who may not have the best opportunities even in their home communities. So they might be adjudicated, or they might be in homes that are not a good place for them to be. So many of the young people have chosen to go to, say, Chemawa, or I'm trying to remember the names of some of the Sherman Indian School and so forth. So this slide is just highlighting some of the key reports that began to surface then as early as 1928. So after a number of years of Indian policy, this report, the Miriam report, is very famous for taking time to actually go out, survey Native communities, and examine what was happening as the result of Indian policy. And actually my grandfather was one of the chief authors of the Miriam report, and he was also one of the authors of the Indian Reorganization Act, which is a major piece of legislation that followed on this report in an attempt to try to legislate policies that might build up these tribal communities that had been so devastated, you know, in early reservation life. And so the economics were terribly bad, and the educational programs, you know, were minimal. And so the Miriam report served as a documentation of the status of Native people in the early 1920s. A similar report 40 years later was called Indian Education, a National Tragedy, a National Challenge, and this was during the Kennedy years, and it provided a recognition that even though some things had been done to improve Indian affairs, much still remained that needed to be done. And this report then became the impetus for a whole new series of legislation that was passed to help remedy those circumstances. The third report that's listed found many similar kinds of things, but the major focus of the Indian Nations at Risk study was on strategies that could help overcome many of the barriers. And by then there was legislation like the Indian Education Act, the Johnson-O'Malley Act, some big pieces of federal legislation that provided funding for, I'm talking specifically about education, funding for ways to improve services to Native communities and families. And then the President's Executive Order on Indian Education, there's actually a current one, and these are dependent on each president as they come in, whether or not they want to focus time and attention and resources on Native issues. So there's a current President's Executive Order on Indian Education, and that came in when President Obama began his tenure as president. So as a result of these really important studies, Congress, as I said, began to recognize that more resources were needed. And a couple of the ones that are most well known in Indian country are the Johnson-O'Malley program, and that one is named after the legislator who supported the legislation. So a lot of people don't know that it was an actual person. But the Johnson-O'Malley Act added funds that came through state departments of education, and now mostly directly to tribes because tribes took over the funds, but it was to provide supplemental resources like band uniforms or counselors or tutors or athletic equipment, you know, for schools, and these schools had to be on or near a reservation. So they were to provide additional support in lieu of parents not being able to provide those things for their own children. The Indian Education Act, though, was quite different because it first of all recognized that there were Native children all over the country and that not all of them resided on or near reservations. And so this legislation specifically provided funds directly to local school districts. They didn't go through states, they went directly to school districts to help provide services, things other than like band instruments and you know, sports equipment. These were for and it was couched in a language of culturally related academic needs. And so school districts could hire staff, could reach out to Native parents, and could provide additional tutoring to what maybe Title I for low-income kids could provide, or it could provide special cultural classes. And early on, that was sort of the major use of the funds, was to try and entrench Native children in more of cultural types of classes, but sometimes in absence of academics. So there's always been some tension in the services provided between, you know, just supporting things like attendance, getting kids to school, which is very much needed in some places, versus, you know, taking a class on drum making, you know, that kind of thing. So Johnston O'Malley was more parental support costs, although they did provide things like counselors and homeschool liaisons, those kinds of things. And then the population that they service. So Indian Education Act then provided funds to public schools, even schools in large cities or border towns, wherever Native students resided. Those districts, if they had 10 or more Native children, could apply for these Indian Education Act funds. And that's where often you can find advocates that can sit with parents in an IEP meeting. I did that a lot when I was directing an Indian Education Act program in the second poorest district in our state. And then the third piece of legislation that's listed here is the Native American Languages Act, and really shows how important the retrieval of native languages has become to Native communities. Just in the reauthorization of ESSA, they've beefed up the language and provided more money to support language revitalization, because we all know how much culture is embedded in Native languages, and when you lose the language, you lose a lot of very important things that are of value to the community. So if we know all of this devastating history, what are we supposed to do with that as a Native Outreach Parent Center? One is to recognize that because of this long-standing historical trauma, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of building rapport between institutions of education and communities. So just improving the images of schools as caring institutions, you know, I think is part of the job. Hopefully it stresses also how important just time, commitment, energy, and resources are in terms of making it a priority to reach out to the community. And then also thinking about how much training might be required, you know, of Native parents themselves in terms of how they are as the reinforcers of learning at home. You know, research on Native parent families, and when I wrote the report that I did, just stressed over and over again that when parents are involved, attendance is improved, achievement goes up, students' attitude toward schools can get better, behavior can improve, homework gets turned in. You know, there's all kinds of positive outcomes of parent engagement, but if you are working with a community that's never learned, for example, how do you help a student with homework, then, you know, you need to teach that sort of thing. Or, you know, what can a parent do in talking to their teacher about what a student's performance is, and especially working with special ed students, you know, giving them ideas and resources about how to, you know, even parent, you know, a student that's has difficult behavior or extenuating circumstances. So I think we need to recognize that additional incentives might be needed to actually entice parents or school staff to attend the trainings. You know, and there are all kinds of, you know, sort of incentive ideas that maybe we can talk about in the question and answer part of this, but the whole purpose of the historical background is to think about how much more time and attention needs to be devoted to this area, and recognize that it may not be easy at first, but not to give up because the payoffs are so important. So I just said that extra effort, needs to be made. So what are some things that can be done? Well, certainly the inclusion of teaching tribal history and culture to school staff. And there may be assumptions that because staff are at schools that they already know this stuff, and that is not true. I worked for the Bureau of Indian Ed, and I've worked in all 9 communities that are on or near reservations in Oregon, and sometimes the staff in those schools turn over and they may be clueless about, the history of the community. And lots of school districts provide this type of training, but never assume that it is provided, because in many instances it may not, or it may not be done effectively, and there may be feelings on the part of staff that they're being judged by the community, or they may not feel welcome. I mean, so there's lots of things that can be done to, bridge the sort of community versus school, almost undiscussed attitudes. And certainly I already mentioned that parents will need additional skill building in terms of how to support their own children's learning and behaviors. So I think parent centers can be really valuable in offering some of these types of supports to both the schools and to the communities. I think I've talked a little bit about the support for Indian history, language, and culture, and then working together with Native communities. And I think we're going to be doing an additional PowerPoint just on this topic alone, on how parent centers can work with tribes. But the one that we're focusing on first is working with Title VI Indian Education Act programs, and how you can utilize their resources in helping them support the activities of the parent center and vice versa. So we can talk a little bit more about that later. So that's the conclusion of this particular PowerPoint, and for further information we have the contact resources listed there. So I think we're now ready for questions and conversation.
Thank
Judy?
you so much, Robin. Thank you for all the information. We would love to, again, you can take this PowerPoint and present it at a staff meeting, at a board meeting, and of course, none of us are going to present it as well as Robin did, because she eats, sleeps, and lives this. So if you would like one of our staff people to come and train your staff, your board, your community members on the historical effect of education on Native families, we would be happy to do that. If you would like to just take this information and use it, say you got 15 minutes at a staff meeting, you think, hey, let's cover a little bit about this information, that would be great too. So we are really open to however you would like to use this curriculum. If you need us to add to it, or you need more information about a specific topic, just let us know. There's a ton of information in this one little webinar, and we're really excited about getting it out into people's hands.
Actually, there is one just recently came out from the U.S. Department of Education. One of the other things that I'm currently doing is I'm serving on the President's National Advisory Council for Indian Education, and the Office of Indian Education and the Department of Ed now have a new tribal consultation policy, so that even during this ESSA reauthorization, I have braces, so sometimes I stumble over my S's. But there is a report that just came out based on a number of hearings that were held around the country related to not ESSA specifically, but just what was happening in Indian country. And I don't have it with me, but I know it's posted on the web through the Office of Indian Education.
And we can definitely get that report and post it on our website.
One of our participants said that the report is called School Environmental Learning Sessions Final Report. Thank you. Yes, that is the report I was referring to. Well, hopefully this presentation can help explain what historical trauma is. It's intergenerational. So if you have a parent or a grandparent that, for example, went to boarding school and, was punished for speaking their language, because we're only 1 or 2 generations removed from some of the most severe treatment of Native parents being removed to boarding schools, then they would come back to their community without, as I said in the slide, without parenting skills, with this attitude about education being very harsh, with a loss of language and traditions. And so they're going to raise their children with either conscious or unconscious biases about education. I remember hearing a grandparent talk one time in a meeting about how she didn't know how to treat her own children because she tried to encourage, the first group of children that the oldest of her children to just accept schooling, and this was going now to public schools after she'd come back from boarding school, and she tried to get them to fit in, and many of them had trouble and became disappointed. So the next group in terms of age that she sent to school, she was angry at the public school, and she basically gave them attitudes that this isn't for me, I don't have to participate. And she said in both instances her children came out of those institutions with negative self-concepts, lack of skills, misperceptions about how they were supposed to relate, to the larger society. So you always hear about this notion of walking in 2 worlds. That comes from this historical trauma. People are literally traumatized by the horrible events that happened to them, and they pass that on generation after generation. And so if you start with kids that can't parent and they have children and they don't parent them well, then those children don't parent well unless they're taught differently either. So you do get this whole community-wide lateral oppression is one of the other terms that's used, meaning that we treat each other as badly as we were treated ourselves. So we pass on those negative, traumatic interactions. And so many of our communities are still trying to, climb out of those societies of being an oppressed people. And it takes generations to climb out as well as, to go down that path.
Okay, so I think at this time we'll probably end the webinar, so we're kind of timely about this. But again, if you need the handouts, they're over on the right-hand side. You can also download them from our website. I want to thank Kelsey for running the webinar. I want to thank Robin particularly for all the content information that you gave us, incredible information. I also want to thank Lisa Cooper for editing and making it all look beautiful and flowing. And I think at this time you can email. Yeah.
Could I just interject one question? Because I think it will take longer to answer, and actually I think some of our upcoming resources might be helpful with this, but I think it's a good question that probably everybody would appreciate. It says we try to educate all parents on the special ed process, but clearly there may be other issues that may only apply to Native communities. What are there any other presentations that have been developed to address these specific issues?
That's an excellent question.
And so we do have some that are coming up that, that I mentioned the Title VI one, and we're going to talk about some others just in terms of sovereignty and some of the things that are very unique to Indian country.
Yes, and we want to make sure and respond to the requests from parent centers. So please, if there's information you think we should be developing or working on, just email us, and we have some excellent writers. We have some excellent, as you can see, speakers. So we'd love to get them, give you access to those. So just email us and let us know what your needs are. And with that, I think we will end the webinar. Thank you all for participating, and feel free to contact us in the future.